All right, everybody. Welcome to one of my first streams here for Captive Thoughts. Glad to have everybody here, and I'm here with tonight with Dr. Bob. How you doing, Dr. Bob?
I'm doing well, Pastor. How are you?
I'm doing good. We might be joined in a little bit by Conversations That Matter. If you will in the chat, let me know to make sure that you can hear Dr. Bob. I want to make sure that you guys can hear him. So if someone will shoot me a message in the chat, let me know if you can hear Dr. Bob or not. I would greatly appreciate that. So the main thing that we're going to be talking about today is social justice, more so in the SBC, kind of what's been happening, some news, things like that, as well as kind of going forward, what we need to do there. But yeah, so uh, Dr. Bob, as you just kind of want to fill in on some of the things that you've noticed within the SBC, some of the things that have kind of been happening recently.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we were talking about before the live stream, just um, yeah, I guess my first real interaction with this was about a year and a half ago when I was talking with a pastor friend of mine when I was still living in a different city. He was affiliated with a Southern Baptist seminary and is now a professor at a Southern Baptist school. But he and I were in lockstep on so many of the issues. I remember when it seemed like the big debate within the Southern Baptist Convention and the past 10 years or so was the Calvinism Arminianism issue, and it seemed like the dividing lines were pretty clear in that regard, and that was going to be the big fight that was going to break apart the Southern Baptist Convention if there was anything. But then out of nowhere, it seems this whole social justice issue just cropped up. And I think it was really catalyzed by what happened at the MLK 50 conference in Memphis last year, which, if your viewers don't know, that was a conference that was put on by I believe it was the Gospel Coalition
I think that's right.
um, that put on the MLK 50. Now, the Gospel Coalition, this is I mean, they've had everyone from MacArthur to Piper to all the quote unquote big names and quote unquote big Eva. Um, I think that was a term that Carl Truman, one of our Presbyterian brothers, who's definitely not woke at all, and has seen this coming for a while. He has criticized sort of the parachurch conferences and things like that that sort of promoted this celebrity pastor stuff, where you have, people going out, if you bought the newest John Piper book or the newest David Platt book, and it's like, I respect Dr. Piper, I respect, David Platt and, what they do. And, it's fine and great for people in their local church. And even if you want to have a ministry outside your local church, but I do think that it's almost become like this Christian version of celebrity following. And so the Gospel Coalition was behind the MLK 50 conference. And I remember talking to this friend of mine, and we were both Reformed, both Calvinistic. Um, by the way, Tom, I have Conversations That Matters
Oh, perfect.
contact info, so I'll throw that in the Skype for you. Um, and let's see if I can send him your stuff, because he was the one, I guess, that I'd heard about MLK 50, but I was in a let's see. Let me just throw his contact information in the Skype for you.
All right. Well, while you're doing that, I'll kind of describe my experience. So for me, I noticed a lot of this sort of a little bit earlier. I noticed it back in uh, with the Trump election. It was really, I mean, like I said, it's very difficult because I was seeing from a lot of people that I respected, Russell Moore being one of them. It just this almost this real feeling. Um, this idea that if you vote for Trump, you're like you're ruining your witness. You're just not going to be, it was just like, you cannot vote for Trump at all. This would just be the sort of the worst thing that you could do almost. And so that was the thing that I think was really difficult for me, because I was like, I wasn't hearing them say anything about Hillary Clinton at the time. It was really just focused on Trump, and I was like, what in the world is going on here with this?
Or even Barack Obama. That's the thing that really got me. It's like, here you have the most pro-abortion, redefinition of marriage president in U.S. history, and it seemed to be complete silence from evangelical. I remember distinctly Albert Mohler, talking with Cal Thomas. There's actually a video from Southern Seminary I'll throw in the chat if you wanted to play any clips of that, where he's talking with Cal Thomas, and this is back in 2016. And he is just very much anti-Trump, and many of the things. And it's like, look, there's plenty that we can criticize the president on. We can criticize Donald Trump on. He's not a perfect guy, and by no means did the 81% of evangelicals who voted for the man, very few of them, and I would say a majority, were definitely not under any illusions that this man was a Christian in any orthodox sense. But he was saying some things about religious freedom and about particularly the Supreme Court and things like that. He actually delivered on that.
Yep. All right. And, I think we're here with Conversations That Matter. Can you hear us?
Hey, how are you, Pastor Tom? Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. Good to hear from you. So I'm here with Dr. Bob.
Oh, Dr. Bob, yeah.
Yes, Dr. Bob is back.
So we were just talking about just kind of where we felt like a lot of this stuff within sort of the social justice movement kind of started in the SBC. Dr. Bob was saying that, for him, a lot of it came to a head at MLK 50. Like I said, for me, I first started noticing a lot of it with the election of Donald Trump, where a lot of the big names, like Russell Moore being one of them, but even a few, even a couple of presidents of seminary, the message that was being sent was that, if you vote for Trump, like, you might still be a Christian, but that's a huge stain on your witness to other people. It would be a mistake. It could be sinful in a lot of cases. But this was not being said for any other candidate. It was particularly focused on Trump. And as we were saying,
yeah.
Trump isn't perfect. Nobody makes any kind of illusion that he's, a Christian or anything like that. But it really seemed very imbalanced, the amount of criticism that he was getting, but that same sort of criticism wasn't being done toward any of the other candidates. Again, particularly the Democratic candidate at that time, Hillary Clinton, and that was where I just kind of first started noticing sort of more of that air of social justice, because again, some of this stuff with BLM was kind of happening around that same time too, and it's like, well, what are these people going to think? And of course, after he got elected, some of the articles that started coming out, I feel afraid to worship in a white church and all this kind of stuff too.
Yeah. I remember seeing Conversations That Matters, a Conversation That Matters video back in January. That was the thing that really brought it to a head, because I thought all this stuff was, sort of out in the political sphere and had nothing to do with inside the church, even though back around MLK 50, I had my friend who was in seminary at the time. But I ended up moving, and we sort of fell out of contact for a little bit. And so I don't think we really dove deeper into some of these issues, but that really kind of hurt me, because he was a good friend of mine, and we were in a city, and the seminary that he was at was, a very heavily Arminian seminary. And just seeing like one of my, few Reformed friends who was, one of my best friends through a very difficult season of life on a personal level, sort of buying into some of the woke stuff. It was just like, where is this coming from? And then Conversations That Matter released his viral video on. Well, do you want to talk about that, John?
The video, yeah, it's funny. It's not, some of the videos I've done since then have gotten a lot more views, but I guess to coin a new term, that was like reformed viral, I guess. In this very little narrow slice of evangelicalism, a lot of people seem to know about it. But I think, in like the first week or two, I think it got like 7,000 views, something like that. And people who were paying attention since MLK 50 and the Dallas statement knew about it. But I don't think most people in broad evangelicalism even still know what's going on. I mean, I just talked to someone from FBC Naples last night for about an hour, and it wasn't until they were called racists that they started looking up articles about what in the world is happening in the SBC. They didn't even know who J.D. Greer was. The president of their convention. They had no clue. They said, we don't care. We're in Florida.
So why would we care about real quick about FBC Naples, if you don't mind?
Yeah, FBC Naples is a church, mega church, I guess. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell because they claim a membership of almost 11,000, but you can't find about 8,000 of them on Sunday, I guess. But they're a bigger church in Southwest Florida, in Naples, and they have a big campus. It's one of these. I think they even have some multi-site. It's a big place. Anyway, the short of it is the pastoral search committee was replacing a pastor who was pushed out. Actually, he was forced to resign in late January, and they wanted to replace him with this guy named Marcus Hayes, who did not meet the minimum qualifications. He didn't. He wasn't a senior pastor. He wasn't even pastoring for long enough. There was a number of different things that were problematic about his application, but they decided to recommend him, and it was more than recommend. They really wanted a coronation of this guy. They had J.D. Greer, the president of the convention, write a very glowing statement about him.
You're kidding.
They read that on Sunday morning before the vote. The president of the North American Mission Board did a personal video to the church, and it wasn't like you should vote for him. It was more like, we're so glad that he's going to be your pastor. And
my goodness.
So there was tremendous pressure at that church that Marcus Hayes was the guy. And I mean, I could go on about all the other things they did that were really shady to try to get the vote so that they would push this guy over the line. But it was weird because they had 100 applicants, and this is the guy that they went with. And so there's some SBC politics going on of some kind. Someone knows someone, and he was the guy that some bigwigs picked. But the guys in the pew didn't all see it that way. They wondered, why in the world are we having this guy come? He doesn't even want to continue Bible studies with leaders. He wants them to be group discussions with facilitators. So there was a lot of ministry stuff that they just did not agree with. And there was some questions. This is what's getting all the political heat. There's questions about his progressive political views. And he had posted on Twitter and Facebook support for Black Lives Matter. And he had retweeted some Kamala Harris I guess, article or speech, and there was a few other things. He had said at the church that same-sex attraction is not sinful, and some people started saying, well, that doesn't sound right. And so that was what got all the press. But there was a bunch of different issues that people had, and the search committee wasn't really answering the questions that some of these laymen had, and so when it came to a vote, I think it was 2 weeks ago, Marcus Hayes fell shy. He needed 85%. He got 81%. And what's happened since then is the pastor, actually, I shouldn't even say the pastor. It's like the pastoral staff, I guess, and the leader of the search committee team have decided to excommunicate the members.
Excommunicate?
Yeah, well, they're calling it discipline, but it's not. I'm using the word excommunicate because they didn't go through any of the steps of Matthew 18, Even some people who voted for Hayes, who just offended those who didn't, were basically given a letter from the church that just said, "You're out. Don't come on the grounds. We've hired lawyers already." So a bunch of folks got cease and desist orders, and it's a mess. You have
just like that. No pastors going to them, no elders or anything like that. Just email, boom, you're out.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's not
talk about a violation of biblical standards of Christians not suing one another.
That's right. But that's the justification that's being used, is that this is racism. So they just called a big portion of their church racist, and that's and troublemakers, and in violation of their membership. I talked to a couple last night who actually resigned 2 days after the vote. They were not even members anymore, and they even got the email. Don't contact us. Don't show up on our property. We have a file on you. If you go to another church, we're going to send it to them, threatening. It's incredible. And they're calling this discipline. And you had the whole congregation clap last Sunday when they told them that they were going to pursue this discipline. I've never heard of a congregation clapping for discipline. It is the most bizarre situation. Usually that's a somber moment. You want to restore the person. None of that.
That's if you can get the church to actually go along with the discipline sometimes.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and this is so weird. They won't meet with any of these people. One of the members had asked the pastoral staff, "I don't know what I'm being charged with. I'm not a racist. So can I meet with you?" And the checks they got back was, "I'm no longer your pastor. Please do not harass us anymore." So
what?
Yeah, some of this stuff is out there. A couple, like Pulpit and Pen, Reformation Charlotte, have published some of this stuff. But I've talked to a deacon there who was there 27 years for a few hours about this. It all adds up, and it's all true. So,
oh my goodness,
it's crazy town. It's, but again, it's the whole the woke stuff is what's. I'm not saying that motivated this sounds like it's a power play, but they're using the woke stuff to get what they want. Because if they can use racism as their justification, then they have a moral posturing that no one wants to fight against. And you got the whole SBC circling the wagons and saying, we need to get racism out of here. And there was no racism. So,
wow.
So that's where this stuff leads.
Yeah. So John, maybe fill in the audience, because some of them may not have seen your original video, maybe just sort of an abbreviated version of what was your experience in the Southern Baptist Convention, and where did you really start to see some of this stuff?
My experience was kind of short. I was only in a SBC church for probably like 3 months or so, and I, after that, looked around in the area, but was having a hard time finding a Southern Baptist church that wasn't on this progressive bandwagon. I arrived in 2014, and I had visited the school in 2013. I saw no sign of any of this stuff to my knowledge. Now,
which school was that again?
This is Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Yeah.
Just got to get the names out there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought for some reason I had mentioned that. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of tale in my mind, just because of how fast. I don't if you remember, you probably do, like how fast the polls turned around on gay marriage. It was like, Obama was running on I'm for traditional marriage, and then like a few years later, he does a 180, and so does the whole country. It was kind of like one of those deals where 2013, I didn't see any sign of it. 2014, I started to see a little bit. And then
it's Trayvon Martin, I thought.
Yeah, the shooting, I think, helped. But there was a little bit of it before that. It was just like different events culminating, especially in the election of Trump. But leading up to it, I think the shootings had a big part of that. It's like there was this reaction. And Charlottesville, anything that Antifa was all riled up about, it seemed like the Southern Baptists felt like they needed to get riled up about it too for some reason. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with this same-sex marriage, I mean, I know it was, it was kind of like a punchline back in around the 2000s or so. Yeah, I would say about 2012 is when I started seeing it pick up a whole lot more. 2013, 2014, the media, I remember, was really hitting the church hard. I mean, I remember going back there and just, it was like article after article about how just, if you're a conservative or Christian, you're the worst person ever,
Yeah.
all this stuff. And then, of course, with a Burgerfeld, when that happened, um, all of that, what was going on, it was, again, it seemed like the church was just constantly in the media at the time. That was one of the things that initially, really pushed me into apologetics, is because it was just seeing all this. I was seeing all of these people taking all of these Bible verses out of context, and all these different things, and I was like, oh my
Hmm.
gosh, come on, there are definitely answers to all of these questions.
Right.
Who is speaking on these things? And I guess that was sort of the biggest thing. Is now at the time, I guess I was, I wasn't as more into this as I sort of have gotten into it. I've never really been much into church culture. I mean, like I said, I don't know, I've always kind of escaped that for a large part. But even when I was there, though, it just, any of the people who I really knew of, it didn't seem like they were really talking about it. It wasn't until I really started digging into it that I finally started, hearing voices that were pushing back against this. And that's sort of a
Hmm.
similar thing that, Dr. Bob and I were talking about before the stream, is, that's sort of what we've noticed within the, conservative movement. It's kind of being called conservative Inc., where they've shifted their views on same-sex marriage. It sort of
Oh, by
started out,
far.
we're, no, we're against it. Now, and then it was sort of like, well, we don't want the government involved. And, now it's kind of like, well, yeah, we're kind of okay with it. Um, like I said, it's sort of like, at this point you got to ask, okay, guys, do you realize that you're basically where the Democrats were 5 years ago? Maybe 6 years ago. Like, are you going to be where they are right now in a few years? I mean, as a few years, are we going to be seeing the conservatives saying "bake the cake"? I mean,
Yeah, tell me about it. This Charlie Kirk, I think it was. I saw just the other day,
Yeah.
was posing with transgender Lady MAGA. Was her Lady MAGA? Yeah,
yeah.
Oh
And then
my
that
I
that
was
that
like,
infamous stream where he got asked all those questions, and I can't remember the guy that was on. I think his name was Robert. But
Rob
he's a gay
Smith.
guy. Rob Smith. He was doing that. He did a stream afterwards, or a video afterwards, talking about how he's both gay and Christian and this kind of stuff. The
oh, I
the
didn't know
amazing
that.
Lucas actually did a live stream, kind of going through that video, which was pretty good. Kind of responding
Oh,
to a lot of these things, and of course, again, it's all of that same stuff that everybody's heard, a million hundred times, when it comes to Christianity and homosexuality, that whole thing. Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people thought the initial apostasy was going to come from, is that it was going to come on the issue of homosexuality. I think so, when it came more on the issue of racial tensions, that was a curveball for a lot of people, it seems like to me, because I think a lot of them were like, well, racial tensions had gotten worse since President Obama, because he had just sort of really
hmm,
pushed it a good bit. But it seemed like maybe within Christian circles that wasn't the case. And I think what we're really discovering now, at least as I'm seeing it in my analysis of it, is that we are basically seeing issues that have gone unaddressed for a real long time, and now
yep,
they're being brought to the surface. Things that we thought we were on the same page with, we really weren't.
Uh,
yeah,
question
yeah.
question
I
I
can't
have for
point
you.
anyone to a Christian response to critical race theory in book form. No one's written the book. Like, we're so behind right now.
But I mean, I
Well,
think these things have existed. I think these tensions have existed for a long time. They just hadn't really been discussed. Because
I
I
have a
Well,
remember
question.
back when I was in a preaching class in Southeastern, one of my teachers, professors there, he was an African American, and he was talking to us, because the conversation came up about, whatchamacallit, delivery and this kind of stuff. And just kind of in the context of that, he was talking about how liberation theology, he's pushed sometimes, by churches that he goes to speak more in liberation theology, that he really has to balance between being biblical and moving more into that liberation theology. Um,
wow.
And at the time, it's like it didn't quite click with me then, but I remembered thinking about that here. So, like I said, I really think that these are a lot of issues that have existed within these churches, black churches, white churches,
Yeah.
whatever, for a long period of time. And what it could be is that we could recognize that really and truthfully, we haven't ever been on the same page. I don't
Well,
know,
I
maybe
think,
that's not the case, but that's sort of the way that it's starting to look. And again, I don't mean that in
yeah.
regards to black and white churches. I mean, you're either on board with, sort of the more critical race theory, and that's sort of where you've been, or that's where you're going now, or you're going to hold to a biblical standard, a biblical understanding of the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, Thabiti Anyabwile, Eric Mason, these guys, you go back, 10 years even, they weren't saying a lot of the things they're saying now, at least with the force. Like, something has changed. And maybe you're right. Maybe internally they were different.
I have a question for you guys, since y'all both went to Southeastern Seminary. And I know, John, in your original video back at the beginning of the year, you talked a little bit about this, but how did this come into the seminaries? As a guy on the outside looking in, I'm obviously very educated, but in a very different field than both of you guys. And so I can't necessarily speak to that. I can only see what I see in the context of my local congregation. But where did somebody like Danny Aiken and, I look at, even Dr. Moeller, like whenever I listen to his briefing, going all the way back, it seems like this, it just seems like this came out of nowhere. What happened to these guys? Dr. Moeller, you had the issue at the Shepherds Conference where he was out at John MacArthur's church, and Phil Johnson asked him, "Where are you on these issues? We don't ever hear you talk about this on the briefing." He talks about a lot of really important things, whether it's the gay marriage issue or religious liberty issues, conscience rights, stuff going on overseas. But in this particular area where we need leadership, J.D. Greer just seems to be going off the deep end, and it's like it's not
We're
even.
all becoming Presbyterians. No, I'm just kidding.
It's like this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the things I think is important to recognize is back when I was in seminary, which I went from seminary to 2010, 2013. So that was when I was at Southeastern. Back during that time, race was not something that I really thought about. So the pushing forward, it was when you heard someone thinking of racist or prejudice, it was in a much different context than it was today. Like, the racist, that was the person who was, the southern hick who just didn't like anybody, right? It was very much these, sort of stereotypical, TV kind of, TV perceptions of racism. And I think that was the general perception of the culture back then, back in 2010, which is, it's been so long now. But there were hints of it then. But I don't think people really understood what was happening. Like, again, I was thinking back to one of the classes, and one of my professors was saying by like 2050 or something, 2053, I think is what he was saying, is that predominant when people think right now, when people think of Christian, they think of white Europeans. He was saying that. He said, when people think of Christians, they think of, white Europeans, Americans, that kind of thing. He said by about 2053 or so, when people hear Christian, the way that things are going, they're going to think of a Hispanic Pentecostal woman. And he said, now, if you feel bad about that, if you don't like that and you feel bad about that, you maybe need to examine your heart.
What?
Now, it didn't click back then. I think, because when I hear that and I'm thinking, well, I guess that's right, because it's like, there's an aspect of truth in that, right? Why should I want to think of Christian as, just like belonging to white people in that sense? Of course, at the time, I was more concerned about the Pentecostal thing. I was like, why are we letting the Pentecostals take the, term of Christian? Come on. That was more what I was thinking. But it tells you, how far, race wasn't really a part of it. But I think those are sort of some of the seeds that were kind of.
What if they?
And I could probably, if I really thought, I could probably think of other things from other professors that you can kind of see it more now, but they had been sowing them back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
What's sad is that. Oh, go ahead, John.
Go. I'm sorry.
I was just going to make an offhanded comment and also say that I have a question in a little bit, but not for now, because I want to ask about a particular individual within the Southern Baptist Convention who I think you both know who I'm talking about just by the tone.
Go home.
But no, not that particular individual. Another one who likes to talk about Sesame Street and what it can teach us about the culture and about the church. But the sad thing is, Tom, I think that a country Pentecostal church today may have more sound theology than J.D. Greer's church and many churches in the SBC.
Oh, I know it. I was just like I said. I was like, that was the bad thing for me. Is that's what I was like. I was like, geez, we're really falling down on the job. And I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
It's interesting that question you asked about, or who said that? Who said, hey, if that makes you have a problem with that, you need to examine your heart. Was that a professor you had?
That was the professor. Tom? Yeah. Now he's not actually at Southeastern anymore, but he was teaching there when I was going there. I think he's gone. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, because what if you went to the Apostle Paul and said, this religion in a few years is going to be full of Gentiles. I know it's Jewish now, and that's your people, but hey, if you had a problem with that, you need to examine your heart. Paul would be like, look, of course I'm a missionary to the Gentiles, but like I love my people, and I think we've lost that, the loving tangibles, loving community. That there's really nothing wrong with, and this isn't a race thing really necessarily, but it's just like loving the people I share a lot of characteristics with doesn't mean you hate others. And that there's this like bifurcation now that's like you got to choose one. It's like, why can't you? I have a special love for my wife that I don't have for other women, but it's not that I don't care about other women. You know what I mean?
Well, no, I mean I think that was one of the reasons why groups, like the alt-right gained a lot of steam is because when they brought that up, why is it okay for every other ethnicity to be okay with their ethnicity, but then when you get to white people, they're not allowed to like that? In one sense, that's a valid grievance, right? I mean, that is a double standard. It's like, okay, so either A, everyone's striving to be colorblind and we sort of strive for colorblindness, or we recognize, okay, yeah, it's, we can sort of like particular demographics and kind of favor that, but at the same time, right, recognizing those don't define everything about a person.
Yeah, excellent point.
I think it's okay you can disagree with a group and recognize that they still have legitimate grievances. Even, again, people that you strongly disagree with, there's a reason why they can be built up so much in numbers is because somewhere in there are nuggets of truth that they're pointing out.
Yeah. I was going to go back to something Dr. Bob asked about, where did this all come from, especially in the SBC with Al Mohler. And,
Plug your movie.
My movie. Oh, the Enemies Within the Church movie. Yeah, they're gonna talk about some of that, some of the funding that has come in through left-wing sources and so forth. Enemieswithinthechurch.com if you want to find out more. And I do think that's going to be a really important moment when that comes out. But anyway, I've never heard anyone else say this, and it doesn't mean that other people aren't in the same boat, but about 10 years ago, I used to listen to the briefing every day, and no judgment for those of y'all who still do. That's fine. I think you do, Dr. Bob, right? You still listen to the briefing.
I still listen pretty much every day when I work out in the mornings.
Not every day, but I'm a regular listener.
Yeah. So, and which is fine. I actually, though, about 10 years ago, got so annoyed with it, I stopped listening. I was like, I don't need to listen to this. And the reason that I did was I felt like every time there was a shooting or anything that like touched on race, Mohler would go on this like tangent for a few minutes about how horrible the black experience is in America and like get way off the news topic. And I was like, it just seemed weird to me at the time. And I remember there was this one episode, and I wish I knew what the event was. It was so long ago now, where Al Mohler kind of jumped to conclusions. It was a shooting, I believe. And he had said, well, even if this was legitimate, you got to understand how this is perceived in the black community. And, somehow their reaction was legitimate, even if we didn't have all the facts yet. And that was when I was like, all right, like, I can't do this anymore. And I wonder whether there is a huge just a sense of white guilt, I guess, in the SBC that they have been. I mean, if you look at their resolutions since 1995, when they apologized for slavery, about every 2 years, there's another resolution that's similar, where they have to denounce something that either is related to slavery or segregation, or the stain of Cain was one of the recent ones. And I think that's the Achilles heel of the SBC. Like, the homosexuality doesn't work as well with them. They're a little more grounded on that, but they've been sensitive about the race thing for years. So if you are going to try to introduce critical theory into the SBC, that's the most obvious.
John.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple of questions that I have related to this, sort of, going with this thread. The sort of bigger fundamental question I've had to ask myself, particularly in light of you saying this all the way back in 1995, and it's like, we can talk about Southern slavery here in a little bit, but the question I've asked myself was there ever really a conservative resurgence? We talk about the heroes of the faith of Paige Patterson and Al Mohler, and them taking the Southern Baptist Convention back from sort of Protestant liberalism at the time, but it seems like things were good for a while in the words of John MacArthur, but he's like, now it's gone. He's like, it was good while it lasted. And so that makes me ask the question, was there ever really a solid foundation with the conservative resurgence? And then B, you mentioned to me in one of the churches that you visited that it's a church I'm familiar with, as both of you know, about what was being taught in the intro class for new members and the history of the Southern Baptist Convention and how that was being portrayed in the new members class.
Yeah, well, I don't know how long. I mean, essentially the line you'll hear in any Southern Baptist history class or church membership class where they talk about it is the Southern Baptist Convention was born out of a desire to protect the institution of slavery and perpetuate it, and it was a racist motivation, and it's kind of like a one color. They don't really get into any of the nuance. Sometimes they'll mention the mission board in Boston, but anyway, that may have been going on for a while. I mean, I'm kind of new to the SBC, so I know that was how it was a few years ago, and I'm sure it's probably on steroids now. But if you start the story that way and then you continue it, it's kind of like the document Al Mohler put out, I think it was about a year ago, about Southern Seminary. It starts with, we formed in slavery, and then we perpetuated slavery, and then we were part of segregation, or at least we didn't stop it. And like, fast forward to now, we got to do something about this. And it's kind of that last link in the chain where we have to do something that they insert all the critical theory stuff. So in some ways, there's a legitimate, I think part of it is misinformation. I don't think they usually tell you the full story, but let's just take it at its best face on it. There's a legitimate outrage you may have about past injustices. And then those injustices have been ended. At least, I mean, point me to the law that, says segregation is still in place or something. You can't. But we use that, soften someone up morally speaking so that they're outraged and they want to do something, and then you give them something to do. Well, go support Black Lives Matter, or go, decenter whiteness and promote quotas and affirmative action and that kind of thing. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I think it's part of a strategy, and it just works so well on Southern Baptists because their history, they were already guilty about it. You know what I mean?
Well, and I mean, if I could play armchair psychologist a little bit here, have you guys ever seen that picture of Billy Graham and Martin Luther King Jr. coming out from the plane?
Yes,
yeah.
So, yeah.
Like in my history class, my professor actually talked about that, and he talked about, that picture, Dr. King and Billy Graham, they were arguing the whole time on that plane.
Because I bet they were.
Oh, going back and forth. Well, because Billy Graham was really emphasizing the gospel, and he was basically calling for Dr. King to be patient. He said, look, be patient. The gospel is going to transform people. And Dr. King's like, no, something has to be done right now. We need to
Yes,
go. We need to push on this. And so they were just, constant this back and forth.
you're
And
100% right about that. Yeah.
and what I'm wondering with this is some of the people who are in the SBC now, they grew up during that period, right? That is their immediate history. I'm wondering if
Hmm.
they sided more with Billy Graham at the time, and now they feel like because of culture, because of the way
Yep.
things are looking, maybe we should have sided with Dr. King.
Oh, I think you're 100% onto something there. I talked to Danny Aiken on the phone a few months ago, and and we were specifically talking about reading the Bible through cultural lenses. I said, Dr. Aiken, you got a hermeneutics professor at your seminary who says you need to rid yourself of a white privilege lens before approaching Scripture. And I was just like, that is perspectivalism. That is, you can't have that and inerrancy. And he said, well, I grew up near Stone Mountain, which your viewers might not know. There's a big etching in Stone Mountain of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, and I think Stonewall Jackson. And so he goes, I grew up in the shadow of Stone Mountain, Georgia, and so my experience is going to be a little different than someone who might have a more diverse background. And he said it, I couldn't see him. I was on the phone, but I just imagined him, the way he said it, of kind of holding his head down, kind of ashamed of where and I was thinking, what a blessing to grow up around Stone Mountain. I mean, look, there's actually some heritage and culture you can be proud of in that, but he's not. And I think you're onto something, that there's wanting to sort of amend for where we came from, who our parents were, make up for it. And, even if there is something legitimate there to be said, like maybe even if there is, sins of our parents, that's what the cross is there for, right? So.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, maybe perhaps even their own sins. Maybe they
Or
didn't.
their own sins, yes.
Yeah, maybe they didn't say something that, and they're thinking about it, and so every time it's like, well, gosh, this is, of course, again, a lot of that also just, one of the biggest things I think is it's because there are elements of truth in there, but then there are also elements to where it's not true, where it's like, well, white people only are where they are today because of slavery and because of what is it, segregation. If we hadn't been if black people hadn't been enslaved, there hadn't been that. When we'd be at a similar spot, and there's aspects to that to which is true, but then
Here's
there's
the
other
thing.
aspects that's false about that.
Here's the thing about that whole argument, though, and this is what really just makes me mad. As someone who is a Southerner, the South was not faultless leading up to the Civil War, nor was it faultless during the Civil War. But I'm not ashamed of being a Southerner. We have a unique heritage and a unique tradition in this part of the country that I think has resisted liberalization far longer than most of the rest of the country. And part of that comes back to that sense is that we actually stood up to the United States federal government, on the basis of constitutional principles and on the basis of what the founders of the United States actually believed in. The idea that local government and that limited government is the way to go. That's how you restrain the evil of totalitarian, states and the impulse of, the impulse of empire and the impulse of, a bloated national government to dominate its people.
Yeah.
I introduced my girlfriend, who is not from this part of the country on either her dad's side, and her mom is is from Eastern Europe. And we watch Gone with the Wind together, and it's like, yeah, there's stuff that was glorified and romanticized about the antebellum South that should not have been. But what that movie showed was that culture was destroyed. That nation was destroyed during the Civil War. All the benefits that were reaped from slavery, all the economic production, all of those plantations were destroyed by the North during the war. The South was left impoverished after the war. And if you look at the actual production, The vast majority of production and GDP that was produced in the late 1800s, it was not produced by slaves on cotton plantations in the South. It was produced by factories in the Northeast and in the Midwest. I think it was something like 94% of America's economy was based off of domestic manufacturing and logging and things of that nature that had nothing to do with the cotton trade in the South or the tobacco trade. It was something like only 6% of GDP was actually based off of slave labor in the South. So the vast majority of the economy wasn't based on that. And so this whole idea that, slaves built the country, that's just not true.
Well, it depends how you look at it, because we probably grew up learning that cotton was king, and that the tariff. Well, if you had a good history book, you learned this, that the tariff was funding the federal government, and the North did not want to give that revenue up, and they thought they could get a better deal with England rather than pay the Northern tariff, and so cotton was what. The North wanted cheap cotton for their factories, and that's an economic way to look at it. But now, and I'm assuming, I don't know, are you guys on board with that? Were you taught that in history? I'm assuming people our age probably were.
Yeah.
So now, because I work now in the historical field and I teach this stuff, they are not taught that anymore. Cotton being king is not. It's very interesting. Now this country was built by slaves. So instead of the commodity, the product, cotton, we are taught that it's actually the labor force that we need to focus on. And that's a shift in historiography, because I think Howard Zinn was a big part of making this sort of history from the bottom up popular. But in the people's history of the United States, it's communism. That's really what it is, just to be honest. He doesn't footnote anything. He just gives you the story from his perspective, and his idea is we need to tell the story from those who are the more downtrodden, who haven't had a voice. And in some ways we can say, yeah, I mean, there's good narratives that we should probably look at, but he looked at it as a power play, that those who are in power have been telling their side of this for too long. It's time for those without the power to have their voice heard, and their voice needs to be the dominant voice. And so now we're 3 generations away from Howard Zinn, and his disciples like Eric Foner, being one of the major ones, have pushed this narrative so hard. That's all that exists in history. I mean, you read history, basically, it's critical theory now. And so you look back at the past, and the only thing you see is race, gender, sexual orientation, power relationships. That's it. You don't see the other side, the economic side. Richard, you were just talking about the constitutional principles. You don't even look at those. Doesn't matter. All you see is race, and you even cherry pick that to just get the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. And I hate it, because history is as complicated as people are. And it's tangible. That was the
straw that broke the camel's back for Southern secession.
What was?
The straw that broke the camel's back. What I was taught was that it was the fact that Lincoln got elected and his name wasn't even on the ballot in Southern elections. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. That's when they're like, we've got no voice in our country anymore, so we're out of here.
Exactly, yeah. That was a big part of it. I think the other thing you could see is, I mean, the secession happened in waves. So the lower South saw, okay, Lincoln is basically a Whig. He's a Republican, but he's taken Henry Clay's Whig platform, which was going to punish the South, raise the tariff, even the whole slavery in the territories debate was more about free white labor to the Republican Party in the North. They wanted the territory for white people. They were actually racist about it. And the South said, in order to get rid of slavery, which, by the way, the Confederate Constitution outlawed the slave trade. But in order to get rid of slavery, they had to do it smart. And you needed compensation. You needed integration. You couldn't just emancipate, and you'd have an economic disaster on your hands. But there was no plan. No political party had a plan to do the integration and the compensation. And Lincoln, they were afraid, and I think this was, some of the hotheads were afraid, I should say, that he was going to put an end to he was going to make sure that the institution did not extend anywhere else. Now, if slavery does not extend into the territories, then that means the rich Southerners could not go, the influential Southerners. And so a Southern influence was not going to be there. And if a Southern influence wasn't there, then they would not have representation. And so the lower South, I think that's what they're looking at. But the upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, they saw Lincoln's mobilization of troops, and that's why they seceded. And you don't see any mention of slavery in their declarations. It's just, we're being invaded. I'm not going to be in a country where the federal government invades. And so, that for them, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. So it's more complicated than I think it's made out to be. But if you go to a Southern Baptist school, I think you're just going to hear slavery, 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 and we were wrong, we were wrong, we were wrong. And it's just not. It's not interesting. It's not human. It's. So
what you're saying is it's not a complete perspective on what happened.
No, it's for modern political purposes. They're telling the story to foment divisions in the here and now. And I don't buy this whole thing that race relations are so bad because of slavery. No, they're not. They're bad because people are conditioned to think of themselves as victims and oppressors. Stop talking about it in those terms. That's the past. So
my girlfriend's mother's family suffered in Eastern Europe for 70 years at the hands of people who came to quote unquote liberate them from their oppressors.
Yeah.
Well, and like I said, I think this is one of the biggest things, as Dr. White has pointed out several times, to where this idea of oppressor and oppressed and constantly thinking about it, it is catastrophic to the gospel. Because it's like, How can you sit there and think about past oppressive, past ways that you've been hurt, you've been victimized, and have this sort of animosity towards your oppressor, and, you need to be demanding that they change and all this stuff, and at the same time say, but Jesus has saved me, he's forgiven me, and it's like, wait, how do you hold both of those together?
Yeah.
I mean, how can we look at the cross and see what our God suffered for our salvation, to forgive us by pure grace, and then have the gall to bring past grievances into the house of the Lord? And this isn't to say that we don't talk about justices or injustices. There's a huge difference there. And of course, again, as I've looked at this, and when it comes to, minorities or those who are considered the oppressed, to me, it's liberalism 2.0. And then when you look at the oppressors or the majority, it's Roman Catholicism 2.0, essentially. I mean, it's you've kind of got those two aspects of this here where, again, essentially it's you're taking the scriptures and you read this stuff back into it. You're not actually reading the Bible for what it's supposed to say, and then in that aspect, right, you're not actually exegeting the text. Again, you're reading these traditions, you're reading these ideas back into the text. For the oppressors, so to speak, they have to constantly work towards not being an oppressor, but there is no hope for them. The cross cannot cover their oppression. They have to be constantly doing things in penance. And again, I think that's a great word. Even if they can't be repentant, they have to be penitent. They have to be constantly paying penance, but it's never enough. It has to be constant and always. And if you ever stop, anything that you did is forfeit. It's done. So you can be penitent for 50 years and then you stop, or you're not penitent the way that you're told, and now all of that's negated. You're back to where you started. You're an oppressor. You're bad. You're wicked. All of these things. It's a completely hopeless system. And then again, for the oppressed, in one sense, it's hopeless for them as well. That they are always stuck as oppressed.
Yeah,
It's the old bourgeoisie proletariat line from Marx. The bourgeoisie have caused all the problems in the Russian Empire. They've caused all the problems in Europe, and they have to be destroyed. We have to have this perpetual revolution, of the proletariat. But until one day we enter, it really is like structurally Christianity though without Jesus. You have a beginning, you have a time of prophets and fathers, and you have a gospel, and then you actually have an eschaton. You have an end times scenario, It's just the wrong one.
The scary part is that every totalitarian system in the West has started out with, and there's been some, I guess, resistance from church clergy, but for the most part, there's been some element in the church that wants to go along and do some syncretism with it. It happened with the Nazis. It happened with the communists. And what usually happens is the church wants to maintain some kind of relevance, which is exactly where the SBC is right now. They want to be relevant to the culture, and they end up getting pushed aside because ultimately the culture does not care about them. They're trying to.
I'm about to scream it, John. I'm about to scream it. The name. What? How does this relate to a certain individual by the name of Russell Moore?
Oh,
and the ethics and religious liberty.
You want to hear something fascinating? I was reading today. I'm doing my thesis in my history program on the kind of like the rise and fall of the religious right, like what happened. And I think my thesis is going to end up being the religious left was on the move hardcore. Social justice in the early 70s was the way Christianity was going. You had the Chicago Declaration, the Lausanne Covenant, you had Ron Sider and Jim Wallace running around, and there's a book that was written. I can never pronounce the guy's name. It's like Lubido or something. Anyway, he wrote this book called The Young Evangelicals in 1974, a year after the Roe v. Wade decision. And he basically says evangelicals they're basically adopting communism. And all of a sudden, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, all those guys, they form the religious right. And it kind of like puts a wrench in the gear system of the elites. And this is I'm convinced the elites didn't go away. They lived on. And there were two wings of them in the 80s. You had the thoughtful evangelicals, which were the respectable scholars. Think of like George Marsden and Mark Knoll, Nathan Hatch. And some of those guys have some really good writing. I'm not discounting everything they say, but they were different than the religious right. They actually wrote a book critiquing the religious right together, and they didn't like it. They really liked Kuyper. Kuyper was their guy, and interestingly enough, Kuyper's the guy now that Bruce Ashford and Russell Moore and Tim Keller like. And so this kind of percolated in evangelical institutions like Wheaton and Fuller. And then there were like the Ron Sider, Jim Wallace guys who were still like radical left, and evangelicals kind of dismissed them. Well, guess who's back in town? Ron Sider just recently did a conference with Russell Moore. Jim Wallace just met with Tim Keller to figure out how to get rid of Trump. Those guys are linking back up with the evangelical mainstream, and the Marsdens, the Knowles, the Hatches. I mean, they are prestigious, and their followers, like Thomas Kidd, I think was Mark Knoll's student, or George Marsden's student, I should say. Like, they have prominent positions in the Gospel Coalition. And I think what we're seeing right now is revenge on the religious right. And I'll just say this last thing. I was reading this book today, and it was kind of cataloging all of this stuff, all these moving parts. Had this whole section on Al Mohler, which was absolutely fascinating. Whole section on Russell Moore. One of the things about Russell Moore, though, is, and this is a secular author, godless, left of Hillary Clinton. I mean, and he says Russell Moore gave up inerrancy in the book. I can show you the quote. And I was like, wait a minute. You have this secular author saying that Russell Moore gave up inerrancy, and he looks at Russell Moore and says this is a shift in the Southern Baptist Convention away from Richard Land. And it's a quote where Russell Moore talks about homosexuality, and how when we read the Bible and we read about homosexuality, this is after the Obergefell decision, he said we have to read it from we have to understand there are other perspectives out there, not just our own. And it was at this point the author goes, yeah, Russell Moore gave up inerrancy. And I think he's right. I think Russell Moore was a change agent from the beginning.
And he was never legit.
He was I don't think he was ever legit. I think that the whole entire time he had this plan in mind. And to tell you the truth, and I got to be careful of how much I incriminate Al Mohler in this, but I think Al Mohler was at least partially aware. He couldn't have been completely ignorant about that. So, yeah, it's it's kind of
So,
scary to see
so,
kind of.
so
Go ahead.
you mentioned John, for our listeners who may not know, because Tom sometimes gets crossovers from other YouTube channels. What is the Gospel Coalition, and what does the Gospel Coalition have to do with sort of the woke evangelical movement?
Well, they're a neo-Kuyperian, which is Abraham Kuyper, theologian, Dutch theologian in the 1800s. They're the part of the New Calvinists. So if you could point to an organization and said they're the New Calvinists, you point to the Gospel Coalition. And the neo-Kuyperian evangelicalism, this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but there's a few things that they believe. One is that we need to engage culture. And they don't look at culture the way you just did, Dr. Bob. When you said that, hey, I'm a Southerner. I think there's something to be said for this culture. We watched Gone with the Wind and with my girlfriend, and I'm proud of this, and I know there's flaws. You're looking.
It wasn't perfect, but
it wasn't perfect, right?
Yeah.
But you're looking at tangibles and the stories of real people, and that's kind of how you're viewing culture. It's people, right? Well,
yes.
The Gospel Coalition views culture more as this kind of thing. It's a synthetic, artificial thing you can manufacture. And that's what Kuyper thought. Kuyper thought the Dominion mandate was to create culture. And it's very abstract. And so it's not tradition, it's ideology. So it's taking ideas and infusing them and getting people to recognize them. And I'll give you a good example of it. Tim Keller at his church, he had an artists initiative where artists from his church would get together and they actually formed an organization. And there was a book I was reading by Richard Mao, who's kind of an evangelical left guy. If I'm not mistaken, he's at Fuller. And he was saying, he was actually talking about this and saying what Keller's doing was what everyone needs to be doing. They need to be going and creating culture, which means the arts usually. And so of course we would look at that, I think, on the surface and to say, well, that's great. Yeah, of course we want Christian artists and stuff. But the way they're looking at it is from this very one kingdom approach. Like Christianity is going to compete and is going to win. And you have to have this recognizable organization that everyone can point to. And it's not really culture unless you have that recognition. And I think most common working class people, that's not how they look at culture. They're just kind of yeah, I live my life. I love the people that, I come from and the stories that are associated with them. And culture's organic, man. It's just the stories of people. It's not something that you have to force. So that's why evangelicalism invents itself every 10 years. And the young Calvinists are part of that. So it's looking for the new sound, the new style, that what's going to be cool, what's the culture going to really dig that we can then kind of insert Christianity into and be oh, you think that's cool? Well, that's Christian because we're cool. Yeah. We invented that. But culture has tradition. It comes from a place and they just separate that. It's all abstract. And so that's one aspect. I could go on, but I'm talking too much, but anyway, there's a socialist tendency in there. Kuyper had it too. So redistribution's part of it. There's this weird idea they have about idolatry. Everything's an idol. Your family can be an idol. Reading the Bible too much can be an idol. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah, that's something weird I've been seeing recently from some of these people. It's it's the Trinity. The Bible's not the fourth person in the Trinity. Or, I'm sorry, someone even said the fourth thing in the Trinity. And I'm
yeah.
Who thinks that? No one thinks the Bible's a person, but the Bible is the Word of God. What?
Don't idolize your Bible. That's so terrible.
No,
and what that does is it flattens sin because everything's an idol. So if you have homosexual desires, well, that's an idol. If you have heterosexual desires, that's an idol. Everything's an idol. So there's no hierarchy of sin. So they can now soft pedal things like homosexuality.
I really see that in particularly the ministry of J.D. Greer and the direction that's sort of leading the Southern Baptist Convention. I see that sort of like you said, this sort of neo-Kuyperian, this sort of new Calvinist idea where you flattened everything out. It's all abstract, and there's no degrees of sin, or there's no distinctions that are made. That everything is just as bad, And I think you mentioned, what is it? There's like the "and" campaign or something, John, and
Oh yeah. That's that I don't think Keller's involved with that, to my knowledge. Richard Mao is, who I just mentioned. Ron Sider is, who has been around since the 70s.
I've heard James White mention Richard Mao many times.
Oh,
well,
has
of course,
he?
the purpose of flattening everything out, right, is to put people on an even playing field. I mean, so, you think about the consequences of doing that. You take the person who is striving to follow the word of the Lord, who strives to, takes care of their family, loves their family, but now they get placed on the same level as the person who sleeps
A drag
around,
queen.
right?
Yeah.
The drag
Yeah.
queen, so you guys are basically, and on the one sense, there is an element of truth in that, right? In the sense that it is all by God's grace, but that's not the way that's not what they're talking about. They're removing this from justification and from that grace aspect, and thinking about it just in terms of well, you're still just the same. It really doesn't make a difference. Even if it's only because you're justified. There's no sense of consequences or loving your neighbor or anything like that.
And it's one of those things too, where it's so abstract and so like you have to do a deep dive into your heart to like figure out, like, am I idolizing my family? Oh my goodness, you can't just go with the simple biblical commands, because they're like, the Bible says, yes, ultimately their sinful motivations are what cause sin. That's, James talks about that. But most of the commands in Scripture are to abstain from external actions. Like, don't go and lie, don't go and steal, don't, like, it's not telling you to navel gaze all day and examine, like, well, when I ate that lollipop, did I give thanks to God enough for that? Oh my goodness, I'm just as evil as a pirate. Like,
and I mean, to tell you the truth, when you put it like that, I don't know if this was your encounter, but that was something that I really encountered a whole lot at my time in Southeastern. There was this constant look inward at yourself. Are you really doing this enough? Are you constantly enough? And I was thinking back over this today, and don't get me wrong, like, it might have been, and I'm sure it was in some cases, preached, and maybe I just, at the time, I really didn't hear it. But in large part, a lot of my experience at Southeastern, I really did not hear the gospel. It was a lot of law.
yeah.
And I remember I really struggled with that. I struggled with assurance hard going through seminary. I remember talking with my parents, and I was just like,
Oh
I don't
man.
know if I'm saved. I don't know if I mean, how can I be a pastor if I'm not even sure I'm saved? I mean, I've got all of these things, and I remember this is the first time that like that there are two instances here, but this is one of the first times where I really just sort of heard that simple gospel, because my dad was, he's listened to me say all this stuff, because I was just going, this is just like going through a chapel service, just, and he's just like, son, Jesus loves you. And like, for one thing, I'm not a crier. Like, I haven't, like, I've lost my grandfather and my grandmother this
Mm-hmm.
past year. I didn't cry at either one of their funerals, but when I heard that, I broke down in tears. It was tears of joy. That was that first real sense of gospel. And then when I got out of seminary and as I was going through Romans, I mean, it was kind of funny because it's like, it was sort of a Luther thing here, but going through Romans and just hearing that God has saved me, that Christ has chosen me, that I have been saved,
Amen.
it changed everything. And I was just like, why didn't I get this at seminary?
Yeah. Well, you hear gospel issue all the time, that term, and this is gospel this and this is gospel that, but you don't actually hear the real gospel.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
or you hear like, and that's just prevalent a lot, because like I work at college campus ministries, and it comes up, and it's like, so what is the gospel? And they're like, well, love your neighbor. I'm like, no, that's not the gospel. That's the law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
So maybe
fail to
we've
love your
confused
neighbor.
those two, like a long time ago.
But that seems to be just the big thing, or and again, I don't know, like I said, how this can kind of be larger Eva in general, right? Sort of, and I understand that there's a whole lot of mega churches and there's a lot of law preached in there. Um, but I really remember that coming up at, like I said, going through seminary. It was a big struggle. My wife remembers it too. She remembers I struggled with it a whole bit and a whole lot there. And I think it has a lot to do with what you were saying about just this constant just inward stuff. I mean, eventually I had to get to this thing where I asked one professor, I was like, how often should I be examining myself? And he's like, well, sometimes, but you really don't need to do it all the time. But I mean, that's how bad I got. It's like, how often should I be, of course, again, it's like that's when I really needed the gospel. I needed to be told that I was saved, not because of what I had done, but because of what Jesus has done. I needed to be pointed to the cross. I needed him to say, look at the cross. Stop looking at yourself and look at Jesus. And I wasn't getting it.
For by grace you're
that's
saved
the tragedy.
faith.
And
not
again,
yourselves.
people hear that and they probably think, gosh, what is this guy, a Lutheran? I mean, but...
Well, it's more. In some ways, it's worse than Pharisaism. Not in every way. Obviously, there's pros and cons, but because it's so internal, like at least in Pharisaism, everything's an external law. And like if you do your 600 things you're supposed to do, it's like, oh, I'm good. And of course, you miss them, and that's where the guilt comes in and everything. But like with this, it is so hidden, and you can't get at it. Like you just. Because your heart is so hard, you get lost in there.
It's like Big Brother from 1984. He's always looking out for you. You know, it's like the
I don't actually get that, but okay.
Well, I mean, it's like the thought police. Like you've been taught to police your own thoughts.
Oh yeah, you're the thought police. I got you.
That's part of the whole thing that's going on in the greater culture right now. As you look at censorship and things of that nature, is like you're feeling guilty not about things that you've done, but about thoughts that you're having.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that could be, and if that's sort of the mentality that's been going around, from that, I can see how that can very easily shift into a critical race way of looking at things. Because again, even that's all about abstraction as well. That's all about this sort of, maybe you're a secret racist. It's hidden from you. Maybe, is the reason why, you didn't hire that person is because you're racist? Is the reason why when you see somebody who maybe looks like a criminal, it's not that criminals dress a certain way, it's because of the color of their skin, and you're a racist. That it? And you're like,
and I hate to say this, and I am Reformed, I am, but that's where the Calvinism comes into play in this whole thing, because it's the total depravity idea that you're so depraved. Yeah, it's a perversion of total depravity, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think I said this a few years ago, and I think people didn't like it when I said it, but I said I don't know if this could have come from a non-reformed group, like in the way that it's manifested itself. Like it makes sense to me that it came from a reformed group. So if you have reformed people that are not saved, that are not living in the joy of the Lord, but they're reformed, dude, that's the ugliest thing. Like, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. I see it. And it seems like, John, with the project that you've had, some of the people that have been the most aware of this have been people who are not reformed.
It's a sad reality, man. The Pentecostals and the Arminians are like, what are you guys doing? Like, well, you've got your own problems, so.
So I guess just sort of, to start tying stuff together, Tom, you're a pastor, and I know we've talked about, sort of, you and your wife and your family and your church sort of evaluating where y'all are at, not just your own ministry, but even with regards to the SBC. We obviously are seeing what's going on at Naples and, big churches all over the Southern Baptist Convention. You look at J.D. Greer's church and, the big seminaries and things like that. Where do we go from here? Where does the average, in particular, I know other denominations have their issues, but where does the average Southern Baptist, go from here? The average pastor, in the small or medium-sized church, the average church member. the deacon, the seminary student who's, seeing all of this and is like, this isn't the gospel, this isn't Christianity, and this definitely isn't, historic, Baptist practice or theology. Like, where do we go? What should we be doing? What kind of conversations should we be having? And
conversations that matter.
Oh.
So, Pastor, I hate to do this. That's a really good question, and I'm sure Pastor Tom will do a great job. But Dr. Bob, Pastor Tom, I actually got to get going.
All right. Well, thank you for being on.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, and would like to have you on again sometime. So,
you
everybody,
plug
I put a link to his YouTube channel in the chat,
Yep.
so please check out Conversations That Matter. He has got a lot of great conversations on there, so please check out his YouTube channel. Give him a subscription if you like what you hear.
enemieswithinthechurch.com.
And there's a movie coming out, enemiesinthe.church.com. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. This was fun. I'll talk to you later.
Talk to you later.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye now.
So, getting to your question, I would say
Yeah.
for me, the way forward would be that Southern Baptist churches are basically going to have to reclaim their congregational tradition. I think, for a lot of ways, in sort of what I've understood coming forward within Southern Baptist churches is, you go to the big seminaries, you try to hook up with some of the bigger churches. It became, the SBC has become a lot more like a denomination than it used to be. It used to be very much local congregations. Each church was sort of each church was sort of a denomination in and of itself. And there's still a lot of people who really like that, but I think that that's going to have to go even further to where the churches are going to have to raise up pastors from within these own churches, and education of these pastors and training of these pastors it's going to be much more important that they are educated within the church. The church brings them up, the church educates them, and they pull on resources from other trusted sources. So it may not be, we can persist with formal education as much as possible. But I think going forward, it's going to be, you're going to have to evaluate pastors based off of sermons, more based off of doctrinal statements, and I think that should start being a requirement with pastors, along with their resume, that they have a doctrinal statement. Here's what I believe about whatever, and it needs to be a little bit more in depth than just the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. Like, I just agree with that. Like, no, here's an actual doctrinal statement that you've had. Having more procedures, having more policies. And I think it's going to be, again, more incumbent upon churches to really take on the training and educating of these pastors. And again, utilizing resources from other churches as well. I'm not saying that churches should be isolated from each other and that they, it's not that they shouldn't talk to each other. But I think one of the big problems that we've seen is that we've become so much more reliant on parachurch groups like seminaries. I mean, again, a seminary, I'm sorry.
Big Eva.
Yeah, within that, it's made it difficult then if those are compromised, right? Those have to be the battleground. So if those are compromised, then our churches are going, well, no, let's just not, let's not make that, right? Let's not be as dependent on that then. Let's establish, again, we can have our own alternative things. We can have, with the internet, with YouTube, it's very easy to have classes. It's very easy to have lectures on these things, to get books out. There are a lot of really solid professors within a lot of these churches that they can establish, a curriculum for the raising up of pastors, elders, that kind of thing, and missionaries as well. And we can still work maybe within conventions for missions and that kind of thing. But I think that's really where it's going to more have to go, in my opinion.
So what does that do, and what does that mean for the Southern Baptist Convention in its current form? This is the denomination that I was raised in. It's the denomination that I have so many good friends in, and people who are faithful to the Lord, but a lot of them don't seem to know how to address these issues, and some of them, like, I'm not even sure if they would agree with us on this. And I think they might be, our already too far down the woke hole, so to speak. Like, what does this mean for the cooperative program? What does this mean for the International Mission Board, for the North American Mission Board, for all the seminaries that we do have?
And that's what I don't know. It could be that some form of understanding can be reached, to where we kind of come to an understanding of each other. It could be that there has to be some type of separation, and I think for some people it's going to come, because I think that the dialogue is breaking down. I mean, when you've got pastors, blatantly accusing other elders of racism, and that's going on, that type of lying is going on, when you have what happened at FBC Naples going on, these are clear indicators that the conversation is reaching its end point, that you're not going to be able to go further in the conversation. And so to me, it's getting to be pretty obvious that lines are going to have to be drawn, and eventually it's just, in regards to leadership of the SBC, there's going to be definitive moments that'll decide the direction of the SBC. It's either going to go predominantly woke in regards to its leadership, in regards to seminaries and that kind of thing, or not. And it'll sort of stay. It'll go back. I think it'll become more conservative than it has been,
Yeah.
in a while. And of course, this is true on other issues. This is true on issues in regards to women preachers. This is true in issues of homosexuality as well. Um, and of course, I think the wokeness is the door to eventually getting into those other issues, because once you get on the train, there's no getting off. These things are all connected. So
Yeah.
it would, once the same presuppositions, the same arguments, the same ideas that get one to go down woke in regards to race relations take you on the same thing in regards to sexual orientation and just gender roles in general. Like I
Yeah.
said, it just we're not there yet, and that's why for my church, a lot of my people in my church, they don't know a lot about what's going on. I sort of struggle with how much should I tell them, how much should I inform them. I mean, for example, how many people have asked me about the whole Beth Moore John MacArthur controversy in my church?
None.
Zero. None of them have asked me about it. None of them have said anything about it. A lot of them didn't even know that Kanye West was a Christian. I
Or at
mean, like,
least that he's made a profession. We'll see how it
right. Well,
bears
yeah. I
out.
mean, like I said, that he'd made a profession of faith. Like a lot of them, didn't even know that. So I mean, for my people, everyone within my church is just pretty busy with their own lives and ministries here. I mean, that's one of the things, and of course, for me, within a church, the church kind of begins to look like you within after about 3 years of you being there. It kind of tends to look like you. It's a great way for you to kind of know what your strengths and weaknesses are. Because again, the church kind of begins to reflect that in a lot of ways. And of course, it makes sense that in this instance, because I'm not as involved in the SBC, I'm not, I mean, again, John knows a whole lot more about this than I do. My church is very strong doctrinally. They understand the importance of sound doctrine. They understand the importance of scripture, but they're not as connected into the larger church, like the larger SBC, because I'm not like that. If they had a pastor that was, then that would probably change for them. They'd probably be a lot more connected. I mean, and again, my church has also had issues because of sort of the way that the Baptist, the SBC convention kind of was treating the WMU. That caused them to sort of check out before I even got there.
What's the
So,
WMU?
the Women's Missionary Union.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
So, the Southern Baptists, they kind of like withdrew in some instances some support there, kind of, and so that kind of upset a lot of people within my church, and so they kind of, again, that kind of caused them to really back off support. So we're just doing our thing in our community, and I really think, like, for me, obviously I'm going to say this because that's what I'm doing. I think that's going to have to be the going forward for a lot of churches. I think you can maybe, what you're probably going to have is you're probably going to have smaller conventions on a state level and almost sort of build from the ground up again, back up to what you have with the SBC. So you can have your county conventions, and then maybe you can have your state conventions as they become more trusted, and then eventually you can get something on a national and global stage like the SBC. Again, maybe some of these things can be reclaimed within the SBC, but you could eventually reach a point. I think the SBC will continue on, but it's either going to split, or I think what what I'm guessing will probably happen is you're going to see a lot of churches who will sit their SBC in name, but they're really not affiliated with a lot of things. They probably don't give to a lot of the seminaries. They don't give a whole lot to the cooperative program. They're just sort of
Yeah.
holding on to the name, but they're not really involved. That would be my guess going forward. And so I would say that's why I think it's important for churches to really focus more in their first their own local church, and then sort of their regional area and conventions, and then kind of build out from there. And like I said, it might be necessary to more approach these things from the ground up.
Yeah.
Um, but
Well,
yeah,
I think the biggest thing we can do at this point is just continue to be faithful where we're at, to pray that God would raise up leaders, but even more than that, that God would continue to make sure that the gospel goes forth. We were talking about eschatology before the stream, and that is one of the things I do appreciate about our post-millennial brothers, is that they do have that optimistic eschatology, and that we don't have to be afraid. That our Lord is ultimately in charge. He is on his throne. And regardless of what happens with these issues, that God is going to, and this is where it comes back to the positive side of Calvinism as well, that God is going to build his church.
oh,
That he
absolutely.
is,
And I mean, even if you have a more pessimistic, eschatology where it's like, things are going to get worse and worse and worse, and then Jesus is going to return, there's still even more reason for you to go out into the community. I remember this one story that a pastor was talking about. Basically, there was this guy walking along the beach, and he was picking up starfish, and he's throwing them back into the ocean, so that way they could live, right? And another guy comes and he says, well, what are you doing? He's like, well, it's starfish, they can't live out here, so I'm picking them up, I'm throwing them back into the ocean. He said, well, there's way too many starfish, and of course the ocean's just going to keep bringing them back in. Do you really think that you're going to make a difference? And the guy picks up a starfish, throws a starfish in the ocean. He says, made a difference to that one. And that's the
yeah,
point, is that, again, right, what does Scripture say? There's more rejoicing in heaven over the one person who repents and believes than the 99 who didn't. And so even if we go out there and it gets to the point where it's just like one person a year gets saved, I don't think it would ever get that bad, obviously, but even if that were the case, it's still worth it because it makes a difference to that person. It makes an eternal difference to that person.
yeah,
So, whether you have the most pessimistic view of eschatology or you have a more optimistic view of eschatology, because we're dealing with eternity, because we're dealing with people's souls, absolutely you need to keep doing what you're doing. Of course, again, the people that you're around you too, you're going to be blessing them. Obviously we want them to get saved, we want them to repent, but if they don't, they're still being blessed by us, and that's the nice thing. Of course, that's one of the awesome things, is that we can still bless people where we are. We still have those opportunities to take advantage of them, so we absolutely should do that. And we have each opportunity to bless each other within our own churches too. I would say the other thing that we really need to focus on, of course, is recognizing uh, ideas have consequences. Because I think
yeah,
this is a combination, in my opinion, of both a concerted effort, but also just the natural evolution of bad ideas coming to fruition,
yeah,
maturing. So I don't think all of this is directed. I think some of this, again, is just, we're seeing how these ideas have evolved following their logical conclusion. It'll be interesting because, again, I always believe that the SBC is about 2 years behind the culture, and that's probably one of the reasons why whenever
mhm.
with the TGC, whenever they try to really impact the culture, it always comes across as cringy, is because they're always 2 years behind. So
They're
it'll
late
be
to the
interesting.
party.
Do what?
They're late to the party.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, all of this stuff with critical race theory, this was all the junk that everybody else was talking about back in 2015, back in 2014. It was just back then it was the skeptics and the secularists and all of them talking about it. Well, now it's gotten into the mainstream, so now the church is talking about it. The church really isn't ahead of it. If we would just be who we are, we'd be ahead of the culture. We would be the ones actually defining culture if we just be who we are. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing, is because when you're not going out there and you stop making apologies for yourself and you just be who you are, that's attractive to people. It's not going to be attractive to everybody, but it's a whole heck of a lot more attractive than going out there and, well, I'm like this person, but I'm not like those people over there, and, you know, and always nuanced. And that's something I've struggled with, because I've always tried to be very nuanced and careful and everything. It's like, no, just, you know, be who you are. You do a whole lot better really going out there and being confident in who you are than going out there with this sense of apologizing all the time.
Yeah.
So,
Is it all right if I read something, Tom, before we go?
yeah,
I'd
absolutely.
like to. I'd like to read from the Word, just to have something for our viewers before they go, or before we go. You know, because I think some of what we've been talking about tonight, a lot of what we've been talking about, I think part of the solution is to speak truth to power, and to be faithful to God's word, even under difficult and trying circumstances. I actually shared this with a Muslim friend of mine a while back. Basically, is like, what is Christianity about? And because it's very easy for us to focus on the negative and on all the stuff that's been going on, but I think we always need to remind ourselves, what we're fighting for. Not physically, but, as the Apostle Paul talks about, but, we believe in the spiritual realm. We are supernaturalists. We believe that God exists and that he has created everything, and that ultimately our battle is not with flesh and blood, but is with powers and principalities and, the evil ruler of this present age. And that ultimately we don't want any of these brothers or people that we disagree with, to perish eternally. We preach Christ and him crucified. And so I just wanted to leave the audience with Acts chapter 26. This is the Apostle Paul before both King Herod Agrippa and the Roman governor Festus. For those who don't know the context, Paul has gone on his missionary journeys, has been instrumental in founding the Christian faith in the old Roman Empire in Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, Greece, and Italy, and throughout the Eastern Mediterranean region. And from there, it would go on to spread to the rest of the world. But this is really the first time where Christianity comes in conflict after Good Friday and Easter, with the government and with the powers that were. So starting in verse 1 of Acts chapter 26, Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. And this is where we get our term apologetics from. It's this apology in the original language. "In regard to all things of which I am accused by the Jews," and for our audience, he's speaking about the religious leaders of the Jews, not necessarily the entire Jewish nation. He says, "I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all the customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So then, all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, from which the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem, since they have known about me for a long time, if they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee, according to the strictest sect of our religion, and now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, the promise which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God night and day. And for this hope, O King, I am being accused by Jews. Why is it considered incredible among you people if God does raise the dead? So then I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. While so engaged as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. When we had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to things in which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. So, King Agrippa, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision, but kept declaring both to those of Damascus first, and also at Jerusalem, then throughout all the region of Judea, and even to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. For this reason, some Jews seized me in the temple and tried to put me to death. So, having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, that the Christ was to suffer, and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. While Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, I wish to God that whether in a short time or a long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains.
All right. I appreciate that. It's a good word.
Yeah. Well, Pastor Tom, thanks for having me on tonight. Thanks for having John as well. We have a great God, and he is in control.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'll see you later, Dr. Bob. If you have to head out, that's fine. I'm just going to do a quick close here, read through some comments, and do a quick close. But thanks for being on.
I'll stay with you. Yeah, thanks.
All right, everybody. Well, we are almost through with the stream here today. So I did want to read through a couple of comments here, although, oops, I accidentally lost it. So I hope we're still streaming, but I think we are. Yeah, so we seem to still be streaming, so that's good. All right, go through a few quick comments here. And first off, so is Christian dubstep a thing yet? Not yet, thankfully. So Christian dubstep is not a thing, which is good. In terms of, have I played the game Blasphemous? No, I haven't had a whole lot of time to play any video games, honestly, recently. I think maybe in the past 2 weeks, the amount of video game time I could play could maybe be 30 minutes within the past 2 weeks. I just really, with getting things ready for the baby, and we're trying several new ministries at the church in terms of getting out to the community, I've just been really busy, so I have had zero time. But if I get some time at some point, I'll look into Blasphemous, see if it's something that I'd want to play. And of course, the other thing too is that I've really been saving my money a whole lot more. So like if I've been seeing something that, even if there was a game that I really wanted to get, I've been like, I probably need to be saving that money, getting things ready for the baby to come, because we're getting pretty close. It's due in she's due in February. So we're still just working on that, getting that thing. Like I said, we're going to be working on the nursery a little bit tomorrow. We've already worked on it some, but we're just going to be doing some more work tomorrow. So hopefully I can have more of a chance to play that. And of course, again, I'm hoping to be doing more streams as well going forward, do more streams, get some more videos coming out as well, talking about things. I don't know if Friday is going to be the day that I actually end up doing like a regular weekly stream, but I would like to have a weekly stream that I'll do, so I just need to find the right day to do that. But I did want to go ahead and do this today. As far as anything else, though, a book that I wanted to recommend, because whenever I do a stream, I do want to recommend a book. So the book that I'm recommending today is Thank You for Arguing. This is a book about discourse and about having discussions with people. It's not really a religious book, it's more of a secular book. However, if you would like to learn how to be more persuasive in having conversations with people, this is a good book to read. I found it to be really having a lot of wisdom in regards to again, just having conversations, persuading people, learning how to ask questions that sort of get to the deeper issues, learning how to listen, hearing to people's answers, hear what they're not saying, as well as hear what they're actually saying. So, like I said, if you would like to learn how to, and they're not sponsoring this, obviously, this is just me doing this because I like you guys, but if you'd like to learn more about being persuasive, I'd really encourage you to pick up this book. Thank You for Arguing. You can see the author by Jay Henricks. So, again, what Abraham Lincoln, Homer Simpson, and Aristotle can teach us about the art of persuasion. So, I would encourage you guys to check out that book. I've really liked it. Aside from that, everybody, I think that's all that we have for tonight. I appreciate everyone who has stuck with us. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comment section. Of course, I'll do all the things that you're supposed to do on YouTube. Like the video, share the video, comment on the video. All of that, really, if you really like this comment, if you really like this content from me, that really helps me do that more. When I see interaction from you guys, that shows that you're interested in this, that you care about this, that you want to see more of it. So if you do want to see more of this content, then do that, because again, you doing that encourages me to want to get out here and to make more content. So I would encourage you guys, like I said, if you want to see more of this, like the video, share the video, that kind of stuff, interact with it. And that's what I also like. The more interaction you have too, the better content you'll get from me, because as we interact, I get a better feel for you guys, get a better idea of what you want, kind of what, you can use. So make those comments, do all of that stuff. But anyway, hope that you guys have a fantastic weekend. Hope that if you get the chance, if you are that person who does this, that you will go and worship the Lord on Sunday. And everyone have a great evening. God bless.